Hello, my name is Mark Miazga. I'm the author of Tales of the North Woods, Echoes from Rhinelander's Past, a six-chapter book on the history of Rhinelander, and also Tales of the North Woods, Echoes from Rhinelander's Past, Volume 2, which features 7 chapters on the history of Rhinelander. What I'm doing today is recreating a presentation that I gave to the Nicolet College Learning and Retirement community that was well received with about 40 attendees. And which I am going to try to recreate with slides and a few updates from the last time that I made the presentation. So my presentation today is entitled Rhinelander History More Than the Hodag. My focus today will be on the years from the 1600s, beginning with Etienne Brule and his explorations through Wisconsin, and will go all the way up through the 1970s, although not in completely chronological order, but I will cover all of those decades and all of those periods in Rhinelander's history. A little bit about me. Again, my name is Mark Miazga. I grew up in Rhinelander on the west side, about a block from the paper mill. My father worked there for 40 years, primarily as a millwright before World War II, and then after World War II, retiring in 1983. And my mother was a labor and delivery nurse at St. Mary's Hospital before retiring in 1991. The photo here is from one of our Christmas trips to Rhinelander. It shows me sliding down Soraka Field with my son observing while I wipe out. So to get started with Rhinelander history, more than the Hodag, let's start with Rhinelander as the ancient site of an Ojibwe Sioux battle. As early as 1618, we know that Etienne Brule, the early explorer for whom the Brule River and the community of Brule is named, encountered the Santee Sioux in the general area around Rhinelander and points north. The Santee Sioux had been here for many, many decades, if not centuries, and they would eventually do a lot of battle with the Ojibwe, who are primarily known in northern Wisconsin today. The Ojibwe primarily came down south and west from Canada and west from New York and would do battle with the Sioux and primarily the Santee Sioux in this area for many decades. By the 1600s to the 1700s, the Wisconsin River was a frequent site of Dakota and Ojibwe battles. This is documented in William Warren's History of the Ojibwe People. The hostilities would eventually move toward the mouth of the Chippewa River and the Mississippi River between 1795 and 1823. Rhinelander was the site of one of the last Sioux Dakota strongholds in the north as the Ojibwe continued to successfully push them out in their move west. The Santee Sioux and other Sioux Dakota communities would eventually be in Minnesota and in modern day North and South Dakota. There was a likely battle near the Pelican River and the Wisconsin River, where the confluence is near Shepherd Park, and a little bit down from that behind the St. Mary's Hospital on Cable Avenue. The reason we know this is because the original site of the Rhinelander Hospital, which was at the corner of King and Pelham Streets, was only there for a couple of years before a new hospital needed to be built up on Cable Avenue with the Pelican River running behind it. During excavation of that hospital site, the construction crews found evidence of a mass internment of bones. Very few cultures, very few religions would bury their community members in a hasty fashion. That was usually and still is taken very seriously. There's a period of preparation, and then there's a period of grief with all sorts of different ways of honoring that during that process. But hasty interment is almost always evidence of a battle and mass violence. So it lines up with what was going on at the time and is the reason we conclude that there was likely a battle between the Sioux and the Ojibwe on the Pelican Wisconsin River confluence and up into the Pelican River beneath what is known as the Hog's Back. A second older period of Rhinelander history involves Highway 17. Like most highways in the United States, Most highways were built along old American Indian footpaths, and those were usually um, created along rivers where they got a lot of their sustenance from, and near the confluence of rivers where a lot of American Indian villages were created. So Highway 17 was no different. In the early days of Highway 17, well-known Rhinelander pioneer John Curran delivered mail on a route going down to Merrill and back, although Merrill was then known by a different name. By 1855, Fox and Helms was a uh, timber company, sawmill company, and they had a sawmill up near Eagle River for which they hired John Curran to work on. They'd made some improvements to the road, widening it and so forth, so that they could move up wood and other materials to help create, build, and eventually run the sawmill. By 1858, it was widened again, I believe, by Fox and Helms again. And by 1860, it was given the official designation by government of Wausau and North State Line Road. Eventually, this would grow to become today's Highway 17, which primarily ran during those days and mostly since between Wausau and Eagle River. There were other roads running in a similar direction, known by different names. Probably the most well-known road would be Highway 45, leading out of Green Bay. In 1863, President Abraham Lincoln signed legislation to build a military road from Fort Howard in Green Bay up to Copper Harbor, Michigan, and Fort Wilkins. Ostensibly, this was done because the United States feared Canada's allegiance to Great Britain, and Great Britain seemed to be siding with the Confederacy during the war. However, lumber barons of the time were also lobbying the government to pass this legislation because it would help them quite a lot. It would give them another route to bring their supplies up to the sawmills in northern Wisconsin and upper Michigan, and it would be a way that they could get that done without having to pay for it directly. So that road was known as the Military Road, and that ran up through communities not far from Crandon and Three Lakes and all the way up to Lake Superior. That also was known as the Lake Superior Trail for many decades. And those roads, Highway 17, the Military Road, and other roads that connected Wausau, Merrill, and points north, and also the Military Road from Green Bay to points not that far from Rhinelander, were well known and continue to be full of history to this day. The Oneida County Courthouse is one of the most beautiful courthouses in the state and has one of the most beautiful domes. It also has a lot of fascinating history. Oneida County, or I should say the village and city of Rhinelander, were begun in 1882. But for those first 5 years of Rhinelander's existence, it was part of Marathon County, with that county seat being way down in Wausau. On January 1st, 1887, Oneida County came into being as an independent county and separate, as it was carved out from primarily a northern portion of Marathon County. In 1887, the first courthouse was built at the east end of Davenport Street. Later it would become a normal school, and that served its purpose near where today's St. Mark's Church is. Until the early 1900s, then Oneida County Supervisor Arthur Taylor, also a well-known businessman and head of the Coca-Cola Company, had one of the few telephones in town. Some of the commissioners had phones and some didn't. Taylor was a big supporter of creating a new state-of-the-art courthouse, and one of the tricks he enlisted was he knew who the supporters were for a new courthouse and who the opponents were. So what he did is he called all of the folks who had telephones at the time and told them to show up for the next county commissioners meeting promptly at 10 a.m. The custom was that they wouldn't start till 10:30 or even as late as 11 a.m. and a lot of commissioners would wander in late. So he made sure he had all his supporters in line and that they had a quorum so that they could do business. a quorum just simply being a majority of the commissioners present. So he had them present promptly at the beginning of the meeting. They had a quick vote and they adjourned before the rest of the commissioners even got there. By then, the legislation had passed to fund and sell bonds to create the courthouse, and progress was made on that until November 11th, 1908, when the actual structure had its cornerstone laid. And much later in the 1900s, it would be given the landmark designation as part of the National Register of Historic Places. There's the courthouse at night. I still consider that one of the most beautiful photos outside of perhaps some sunrise and sunsets and wildlife photos of the Rhinelander area. You have the dome lit up in green, contrasting with the snow on the ground and a beautiful blue sky in the background. Another famous part of Rhinelander history is the Rhinelander Brewery and Rhinelander beer. Some interesting facts about the early days is in 1882, when the town was platted under the leadership of the Brown brothers. The Brown brothers were what you would consider dry. They didn't think that liquor and alcohol were necessarily good for a community. So on the town lots, they barred the sale of liquor. As a side story from this, if you're ever driving down Davenport Street Bridge and look south to the little island that is right behind Ripco Credit Union, that was the location of a bar that was put up in the city of Rhinelander because it was exempt from the lot designation. And the person there, Mr. Schultz, ran a pretty rough and tumble tavern that was eventually taken down. So in 1882, the town lots barred the sale of liquor. By 1891, things were starting to change. Otto Hilgerman came from Minneapolis and Henry Danner from one of the Dakotas, and they worked together to plan the first brewery in Rhinelander. At the time, there were ice houses throughout the city. There were many companies that extracted blocks of ice to serve as a cooling function for cold beverages and other needs. By 1919, their business was in jeopardy with the passage of Prohibition, which lasted for 14 years. And after, I forget the date, 1933, but after that point, they were back in business and they were thriving. They had a lot of new products, such as the Rhinelander Shorty, which was very well known, the Rhinelander Export. I believe they had a Bach product as well. They reached a peak production in 1960. It seemed like the future was bright, but only 7 years later, the business dissolved. And there was a very sad day in Rhinelander when they dumped out thousands of containers of beer. Fast forward to this day, and we do have Rhinelander beer still being manufactured in Monroe, Wisconsin, and a new company that has started the tap room downtown across from Pat Doe's, and that is where they today sell Rhinelander beer and numerous other products, as well as various side products, hats and books, and many other things. I'm going to apologize here. My computer is hiccuping a bit. There is the Rhinelander Shorty that was very well known, as well as a version of the Shorty bottle that had an arrow through it. Now we're going to move on a little bit later, but still very early in Rhinelander's history. In the early days, from 1882 to 1887, there was no organized protection for firefighting for the community of Rhinelander. People mostly fought fires on their own. And finally, in 1887, Rhinelander began a firefighting crew that featured horses and a bucket system passing buckets of water to people who then fought the fire. Between 1887 and 1947, nearly all structures in the community of Rhinelander, whether commercial or residential, were built of wood, which meant that when there was a fire, it immediately spread into a big conflagration if it wasn't addressed immediately. 1904 featured one of the most devastating fires in Rhinelander history, if not the most devastating, in which the Brown Brothers sawmill burnt down. The Robbins sawmill was damaged, Numerous residences on the north side were burned down, and numerous other businesses and sawmills in what is today's Hodag Park were burnt down. Along the way, there were other fires, including the Robbins Flooring Company in 1948, St. Mary's Church in 1960, the Fenland Hotel in 1965, and in December of 1968, probably the fire that most older residents remember the most, featured damage to 6 different businesses downtown, including Gimbel's, Hodag Pharmacy, Leo's Lair, Luthold Bar, Happiness Card and Party Shop, and McIsaac's. My uncle Don Manning was a firefighter in those days, and he would later become chief. And I remember him sharing a lot of stories about that fire in particular. Modern technology has made firefighting much more efficient and much more effective. There's far less damage when a fire breaks out in the community than there was in the early part of the 20th century, due to a lot of the changes in technology, increased requirements for firefighters, and better training methods. Presidential Ambitions and the Northwoods. This is one I wrote about in 2002, and I do have some updates from the time that I wrote that chapter. Possibly the earliest reference to Rhinelander and a presidential candidate or president is Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt at one point got wind of Eugene Shepard's Hodag, and Theodore Roosevelt publicly called Eugene Shepard nothing but a damned nature faker. In those days, that was kind of the beginning of the Hodag myth, which was being spread in lumber camps, and Shepard was spreading it at county fairs. No one had owned it as made up or a hoax at that point. And then the Smithsonian Institute would eventually get wind of it and seek to schedule a visit in Rhinelander with Mr. Shepard, which never transpired based on my research. But I believe did lead Shepard eventually to admit that it was a hoax. Later references would be to Dwight Eisenhower. Eisenhower most famously led the Army in World War II as Supreme Allied Commander and would serve 2 terms as president from 1952 to 1960. He famously visited the Woodruff Arborvitae area, where he enjoyed golfing and muskie fishing, and even attending powwows in Lac du Flambeau. Eisenhower loved the area. There's evidence of at least 6 visits to that area. But he did also go through Rhinelander in 1965, 5 years after leaving the White House. And he stopped in Rhinelander on the train. The train was coming, I believe, from a blind camp that he had also visited in the Northwoods. And he and his wife were at the back of the train and waved to community members. Estimates of attendance were in the high hundreds, to as many as 1,000 people that showed up to see President Eisenhower. John Kennedy would famously campaign at the Rhinelander Labor Temple in April of 1960 for the Democratic Party support as he was running in the primary for the Democratic Party endorsement. Kennedy showed up at the Labor Temple. He was interviewed by some local Rhinelander Union high school journalists. He also interviewed with the paper, and he was presented a replica Hodag. And at the front of the build of the speech, there was an 11-foot long Hodag that was carved by local resident and Democratic Party member Henry Berquist. In addition, Ted Kennedy showed up outside of the Rhinelander paper mill that year to campaign for his brother, and many of the Kennedys campaigned throughout northern Wisconsin. Hubert Humphrey was the vice president under Lyndon Johnson, a Minnesota senator who worked hand in hand with Wisconsin's Gaylord Nelson on a lot of early environmental legislation, including what would end up as the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act, and was an avid champion for civil rights. Humphrey visited Rhinelander at least twice. He campaigned in Rhinelander against Kennedy in 1960, and according to Chris Gilbertson's I Remember columns, he would visit Rhinelander in later campaigns as well. The Humphrey visit that I'm aware of in 1960 also took place at the Labor Temple, where he gave a speech to the Foresters Association and a Paper Company Association. as he was seeking their support in the Wisconsin primary of 1960 as well. Just a few years later, Lady Bird Johnson, the First Lady of the United States, she didn't attend Rhinelander, but there's a famous play by David Peterson called The Hodag, and that play was presented in the mid-1960s in Spring Green, Wisconsin, and Lady Bird Johnson was probably the most famous person in attendance to see the Hodag play, whose premiere, by the way, occurred in Rhinelander itself. Finally, in the campaign of 1976, Jimmy Carter's wife, who would later become First Lady Rosalynn Carter, campaigned directly in Rhinelander with Skip Carter. On the same day, George Wallace, governor of Alabama, also campaigned for the Democratic endorsement at the Memorial Building in Rhinelander. So the Carters and the Wallaces were probably the most famous that year. I believe John Anderson, the independent candidate for president in 1980, also visited Rhinelander, and there may have been Scoop Jackson, I believe, was a senator from Washington, and he also visited Rhinelander, I believe, in 1976. Rhinelander baseball. Rhinelander has a rich tradition of baseball. And in talking about baseball, I need to distinguish that from slow pitch softball, fast pitch softball, as this is traditional baseball played overhand, fast pitch. It used to be before the dawn of television and the internet and video games and so many other things. It was extremely prevalent in the 1920s. Many businesses sponsored local teams. There were as many as 6 to 8 local hardball teams in the 1920s. Perhaps the best known that emerged from some of these teams was a local team named the Rhinelander Green Sox. The Green Sox were officially a minor league baseball team, which distinguished them from the local hardball teams. And they would become very well known over a course of about 5 or 6 years, and eventually would win the 1923 Wisconsin State Championship for their minor league division. They were led by a pitcher whose name was Wally Tauger, who lived at the bottom of Pelican Street. Tauger would go on to play with the Minneapolis Millers in their minor league, and eventually had a brief career with the Pittsburgh Pirates, and would even play with Ted Williams, the splendid Splinter, the only Major League Baseball player to ever hit 400. They had quite a powerful team that peaked in 23 and 24 and then began to fade by about 1925 and 1926. Along the way, they would play a couple of teams that stood out. One was the House of David, a religious team that the men all wore extremely long hair, and they barnstormed the Midwest in the early part of the 20th century. And they would also play an inning of ball against Satchel Paige. And Satchel Paige, I believe, struck out everyone, or at least gave up 0 hits. There's a picture of Satchel Paige. By the 1930s, most of the local action would be around a local team sponsored by the Rhinelander Paper Company, known as the Ripco Ripples. By this time, roads were getting better, so there wasn't as much of a need to have local baseball right in the community, as this local team could travel to McNaughton and Antigo and Woodruff and other communities to play their local teams. And I don't know a whole lot about after that period from the 30s to the 50s. Certainly when I was growing up, most of the hardball action was around minor and major league, little league teams, and then junior high and high school baseball, in addition to the Babe Ruth League. There may have been other leagues as well, but those were the ones that stick out in my memory. John Dillinger. Most folks are very well aware of John Dillinger's shootout at Little Bohemia in Manitowish, Wisconsin, on Highway 51 North. When I wrote my book, I really wanted to get out the Rhinelander connections, because very few people I knew had any inkling that there were Rhinelander connections to the shootout. So I'll talk about this here. Kay Kranz at the Manitowish Historical Society also has a lot of good information and good presentations on Dillinger's connections to the Northwoods in some of her YouTube videos. So in 1934, the Great Depression was on. Unemployment was at historic highs, and the FBI director was J. Edgar Hoover. There were a lot of gangs committing bank robberies, and John Dillinger and his gang was one of those. J. Edgar Hoover and state law enforcement agents and local had a heck of a time catching Dillinger. Uh, Even when they did, he often escaped. He escaped from jail at least once from a jail in Crown Point, Indiana. And he had a fairly beloved following, partly because he was one of the gangsters that would tear up mortgage notes. In a country with a lot of unemployment and a lot of poverty, many people saw that as a positive thing. And he wasn't really known for violence until Little Bohemia. In March of 1934, he escaped from jail. The FBI was tipped off by Nan Winnetka, the wife of Emo Winnetka, who ran Little Bohemia. She had some family, some relatives with connections to Rhinelander at Voss's Resort just across the highway. And she either visited or phoned them to let them know that Dillinger and his gang were there. And she was getting nervous about their activities. She was getting uncomfortable with some of their behaviors. They were able to alert someone in Rhinelander who alerted the field office of the Chicago FBI. And the first of the two Rhinelander connections are that the FBI agents who would head up to Manitowish landed at the Rhinelander Oneida County Airport. So that was the first connection. They landed at the Rhinelander Airport. That is where they did their reconnaissance and prepared for the drive up and the surveilling of Little Bohemia. The second connection is that they rented a car from a local gentleman named Isidore Tucholsky, who had one of the fastest cars in town. And the references in the media accounts of the time, they called it a souped up job that could go to speeds in excess of 100 miles per hour. The FBI agents left in 5 cars up Highway 47 for Little Bohemia in very cold weather, with some of the agents even having to ride on the sides of the vehicles. During the evening raid, John Dillinger escaped with Homer Van Meter, John Hamilton, and Babyface Nelson. The rest of the history is very well known and well preserved in terms of the violence that occurred there and the CCC man that was killed there, as well as other shootings. Dillinger would meet his end 3 months later in Chicago, famously outside of the Biograph Theater, something that is well documented both in books and the movie Public Enemy. Johnny Kotz. Johnny Kotz was a 1939 high school graduate of Rhinelander High School. Kotz grew up on the north side of town with a hard, strong work ethic and was someone who, during the Depression, had to grab coal from the Sioux Line Railroad tracks that would fall off the trains to help his family heat the home. He first came to prominence in a church league that Helen Onson of Rhinelander also played in, and was run by James Williams, who would go on to be a very well-known education leader and for whom James Williams Junior High School is named. This church league would gather at Central School, and Kotz and other people began to catch the attention of Williams and other coaches. Later on, Kotz and other men, including Ray Lenheiser and Penny Drevis, among others, I think Dale Danfield is another player on that team, would take Rhinelander to the state high school men's basketball championship. The last time Rhinelander won it, 86 years ago. The highlights were that they had a shot called the one-handed push shot. Today we all know the jump shot. Before the jump shot was the one-handed push shot, and before that, men and women primarily shot with 2 hands. Russ Lexell was their basketball coach, and he came from the University of Minnesota and brought that shot with him. It was considered a revolutionary thing at the time. They used it to their advantage. They could get better control with one hand and guide the ball better with the second hand. They would win the state high school basketball championship that year. Then three of them, I don't remember three names other than Kotz, would go on to UW-Madison, where they also brought that shot with them. The Badger freshman team in 1939 would end up defeating the varsity team. This is how good that team was. And they were primarily led by three people from Rhinelander. That team would grow together, and by 1940 season, they would win the Big Ten and go on to win the 1941 NCAA men's basketball championship. Kotz would be named the most valuable player, and he would be All-American that year. After Kotz's career at Madison, he would serve his country in World War II and come back to play a little bit of what was known as professional basketball for a team called the Sheboygan Redskins. And after that, he became a salesperson for a sports supply and product company. He would go on to become president of that company and would be a person who would take his time to meet with students and coaches to talk about basketball and to teach them more about basketball, things he certainly did not have to do after he made the sale. He was considered to be someone of very high character. And in his retirement, when he played golf at Black Hawk Country Club in Madison, he was well known for bringing in a dozen donuts every morning to help the hardworking service workers who maintained the course and worked in the kitchen and serving meals. Also during that era of the Depression that Kotz grew up in, Rhinelander had a hobo jungle. I'm going to mostly talk about the one that was behind the paper mill. But since I wrote this book in 2002, I've learned there was also one at Shepherd Park in today's Hobo Nature area. In the 1930s and late 1920s, the Great Depression was happening. There was record unemployment. People were looking for jobs. And what happened is millions of people would end up riding railroad boxcars. They would sneak up, they would jump on them, and they would travel the country to try to find work because they couldn't find any work at home. So these were very well-intentioned, hardworking people, mostly men, but some women. They would travel out west to try to find jobs in the apple orchards or wherever they heard work was available. Rhinelander's hobo jungle, the most well-known one, was just to the east and north of the paper mill, off of Courtney Street and Phillip Street, and not far from what is known as the Hollow. That hobo jungle was very similar to camps across the country. It was a makeshift camp of shanties and tents that was near the railroad junction and a river junction. Most of these men during the day would go out and try to get donations of day-old baked goods, day-old vegetables, produce, and other things. They would bring the food back to have, they would have a pot in the jungle, and they would have a hobo stew with whatever they could gather. They would also try to find work in the community. They would keep a mirror in the jungle to keep up their appearances. There would be a razor for shaving so that they could look good for job interviews. And in Rhinelander's hobo jungle, they also made things, various crafts out of the wood that they could find and other things, and they would sell those in the community and at other communities as they traveled the railroads of Wisconsin and other places. The most interesting thing about the jungles to a lot of people is how the hobos knew what homes to approach, as they would often approach homes and try to get a meal or some kind of a handout. And if you look at a book by Errol Uys, called Riding the Rails, he provides a great map that shows what some of those symbols would have looked like, that marked unkind homes, kind homes, people to stay away from, people to approach. And our experience of my grandmother on Pelican Street, as told by my Uncle Stan and my father Henry, was that the hobos would come up from the paper mill area with the Wisconsin River, right up to Pelican Street, go straight up to her house at 635 Pelican and knock on the door. Despite being poor, Grandma herself would provide a handout to the hobos, the only rule being that you had to eat on the front porch. And what my father and my Uncle Stan remarked was uh, how they knew to come to that house was a mystery known only to the hobos. It was likely marked with some kind of a symbol, possibly a cross on a tree, another symbol marking a kind home, possibly a rock in the boulevard, or it may have been an oral history or oral tradition that was passed on between the hobos themselves. Lastly, there was also something known as the hot rocks in the hobo jungle. These were rocks that people walked across. It was an area of the river where some people learned to swim during the Depression. Uh, and that is an area where my father went when he was a teenager. Um, he wouldn't tell his mother, but he would go down and talk with the hobos. Some of them didn't have English as a first language. Some of them spoke Polish, which, as a Polish American, my father found intriguing, and met people with nicknames named Kaiser and Jingling Bullets. That was another common feature of hobo culture across the United States, was the use of nicknames in the jungles. The Green Bay Packers, one of the most fun part of Wisconsin culture, I think, for all of us, is being a Packer fan. Uh, Growing up, I had heard my father tell me that he had gone to see the Green Bay Packers at their training camp at Soraka Field back in 1935. As a young boy in the 70s, I thought, really? That really happened? And I was able to validate that indeed. In 1935, the Green Bay Packers had their training camp here in Rhinelander. In July of that year, Curly Lambeau visited Rhinelander to inspect Soraka Field. Later in August, the Packers would leave Green Bay in a bus. They would stop for an overnight in Elko, and they would stay at Pinewood Lodge for several days while having their training camp during the day in Rhinelander. I believe it was on August 31st that they had their last practice, and they left Rhinelander for a game against the Merrill Foxes to the south. I don't know as much about who from Rhinelander was involved in those early conversations with the Packers or with Curly Lambeau, but that is a fascinating piece of history that has become more and more well known. I've seen it come up in some posts on the Facebook site. You grew up in Rhinelander if you remember blank. My Uncle Joe also did a brief interview with WJFW many, many years ago, speaking about the year the Green Bay Packers held their training camp in Rhinelander. And it was, by the way, the first year that the Packers ever held a training camp outside of the Green Bay area. So that is a very cool part of our tradition. And at one point, I know there was efforts to try to get a historical marker up in Soraka Field, but I don't know whatever became of that effort. The second well-known piece of Rhinelander history and the Green Bay Packers is the traveling Green Bay Packer basketball teams that they would put together to build community engagement throughout the state. They would put together teams that would typically go to communities throughout Wisconsin and play either the best players in basketball locally or community leaders and folks like that. I wrote about a couple of such instances, although there are many more. The two I am most familiar with are the one I attended in 1977 or 1978, which featured Greg Koch or Cook, Andre Thompson, and some other Packers playing a lot of the teachers at Rhinelander High School and possibly other athletes as well. And it was a very engaging, fun affair. The Packers were very kind. There was a lot of humor, and it was a really great evening. I still remember it, and I remember getting all of the players' autographs on a Packer poster, and they were very available for the community. One other visit that I found a lot of documentation about was the 1931 game, where Packer players, including Johnny Blood McNally, who would become very famous and would end up in the Hall of Fame, and who changed his name to Johnny Blood after seeing a movie marquee called Blood and Sands. That team of the Packers would play the well-regarded Rhinelander Company B team in the Memorial Building in 1931. That was the earliest reference I could find to a game, but I have seen, again, on that Facebook page, people remembering other games from later decades. So there is some rich history there and still some rich history to be documented. Another sports reference would be to the Rhinelander Hornets. For me, growing up in the 1970s and 1980s, the Rhinelander high school hockey team was a struggling team. They didn't have home ice. There was no Rhinelander Ice Arena in those days. They often had to battle the weather, late springs or short winters where they didn't have as much ice team as a lot of their competitors. The Rhinelander Hornets was a city team, not a high school team, that had its origins in the 1930s through a bunch of West Siders who formed a team called the West Side Shamrocks. And they practiced on the ice at what would later become West Side Park. There's a whole lot of well-known Rhinelander names on these teams. I won't get into them here. They are featured in my second book. As I mentioned, the nucleus of this team was from the West Side. They were primarily known in the early days as a team of brawlers, a team that got into a lot of fights, a team that was very, very physical, but wasn't necessarily the most coordinated team. After World War II, when most of these men would go off and fight, they came back and they wanted to play some more hockey. By this time, there was a man named Larry Dahl who had grown up playing hockey in Canada, and I believe he had moved to Rhinelander to work in the Parks and Recreation Department. He became the player coach, and he taught the team the fundamentals of hockey, passing, staying out of the penalty box, how to utilize their strength in a coordinated but controlled manner. And through his leadership, the team became a Wisconsin powerhouse. Between 1949 and 1953, they would go to 4 Wisconsin state hockey championships, and they would win 3 of those. I believe the only one they lost was by a very close score of either 3-1 or 3-2. And I write a lot about those games and that team and the players in my second book. Around that same time, 1945, when a lot of these men were coming back to play hockey and Larry Dahl was beginning to coach them, Rhinelander also had a World War II prisoner of war camp. The camp was called Camp Rhinelander, and it was in existence between September and October of 1945. In 1945, the state housed nearly 20,000 prisoners of war, with the primary camp being at Camp McCoy and several what they called satellite camps existing throughout the state. A branch camp, as I mentioned, called Camp Rhinelander existed, and it was in an abandoned civilian conservation camp, or CCC camp, off of Highway K, adjacent to the United States Forest Service Pine Tree Laboratory, what is known today as the Sauer Lab, almost directly across from Town Line Lake, but not quite. The camp housed 190 prisoners of war. They were fed with food from the local A&P grocery store. One of the most entertaining pieces is that there was only minimal security needed, primarily because that area, if anyone's traveled Highway K, or as the crow flies going further out to Highway 8, that is a lot of woods going all the way out to Highway 51. And the prisoners of war were very afraid of wolves. And they heard the sound of wolves. That was relatively new for them. And it made the security folks have a much easier job because there was inherent fear built into being housed in the Northwoods of Wisconsin. The work assignments of the prisoners of war were primarily at local Rhinelander farms, harvesting beans and potatoes, doing jobs that a lot of the men who were off fighting World War II and some of the women would have otherwise done. In October of 1945, the camps closed, and this became just a very short period of Rhinelander history, and one that I don't think a lot of people knew about. It was primarily resurfaced in a book called Stalag, Wisconsin, by an author named Betty Cowley, Cowley, a retired Eau Claire teacher. And using her book, I was then able to use the microfilm at the Rhinelander Public Library to do a deep dive and find out more about this fascinating period of Rhinelander history. So that is everything. That is my 13 chapters for my first two books. I'd like to thank you for viewing my video today. And if you want more information, please feel free to go to my Tales of the North Woods Facebook page. I'm happy to answer any questions. I also have a new book coming out in September next month of 2025, where I write about 9 different topics unique to Rhinelander history, including the fast pitch tournaments at Pioneer Park, moonshine activity during Prohibition and afterwards, the history behind street names, the Hobo Nature Preserve, and the fascinating history of the man and his wife for whom that's named, including his internationally acclaimed wild orchid photography. I also have a chapter about Edgar Apperson, who invented the first American sports car and lived in Rhinelander for 35 years, and who also had one of his cars in the very first Indianapolis 500. That's just a taste of things, though. There's 9 different chapters. It's a fairly lengthy book, over 250 pages, and I hope people pick it up. It should be available at the Hodag store, Kids Corner, and at the Pioneer Park Historical Complex beginning in mid-September. It's also going to be available at the hodagstore.com and as I mentioned earlier on my Facebook page. So thanks so much. Rhinelander is full of fascinating history and there is more to be discovered. And we are lucky to have people like Bill Vankis and Matt Persick and Carrie Bladorn who do fascinating work with preserving our history and getting it out there in all sorts of modes. Thanks so much. Have a great day.